What's good, Vam? You already know the drill. I don't have anything to preface this vid with, so I thank you ahead of time for joining me. As always, a big shout out to Nyx and Ratz for the amazing music and fantastic art. Anyway, let's talk about some vampires, specifically the vampires of Clan Brujah. If you ask someone to describe a kindred member of Clan Brujah, the answer is typically something along the lines of vampire punks, revolutionaries, rebels with or without a cause, the Lost Boys, the barbarian fighter and warrior class of VtM if you want to be especially cursed. You would learn that the Brujah make up the majority of any given Anarch movement, and that the clan's lack of organizational structure is surpassed only by the gangrel. If anything, the Brujah structure is defined only by the dismantling of other structures. You would learn that the Brujah despises the Camarilla to the point that, well, let's just say there might be more gangrel than Brujah that remain within the sect as of tonight. Older Brujah would speak on the fall of Carthage once or twice when discussing the history of their own, the words often spoken with anguished reminiscence. Some would hail the Brujah as fallen philosopher kings, while most write them off as pure rabble. Simply put, all of these generalizations are true, but if I had to offer one unique descriptor of the clan that I'd want you to take away from this video, it would be this. The Brujah are not only the sole vampire clan capable of change, they are agents of it. And I'm not talking about the kind of change the flesh sculptors and proteans are talking about. While other vampires are preoccupied with selfishly taking from the world, the Brujah is doomed to change it, for better or for worse. The Brujah are agents of change, and change means war.
Police declared a civil disturbance as demonstrators continue to gather in the UK has been renewed riotings.
This is extremely dangerous for our democracy.
Just about every single major historical conflict for both the living and the dead has had a Brujah somewhere in the mix. More often than not, the Brujah are the cause of the conflict, while others use said conflicts to fuel their own agenda. Others participate in the conflict itself, perhaps fighting and dying alongside mortals. This drive for conflict, either physical, philosophical, or otherwise, has left the actual history of the clan as nothing more than a series of individual accounts and exploits that shadows human history, all loosely connected and primarily communicated via word of mouth, much like the gangrel. The Brujah's disciplines of celerity, potence, and presence grants them supernatural reflexes and speed, the strength to rip heads from necks, and the social aura of a friggin' celebrity. Their clan bane makes them more prone to their inner beast and base emotional instincts, often leading to violent outbursts. This tends to leave modern Brujah with one hell of an ego as they quickly realize they're faster, stronger, and infinitely more interesting than just about everyone else around them, with almost nothing capable of stopping them. It's only a matter of time before they seize or overthrow their way into a position of power, to which they do what most do after obtaining influence: proclaim and change. Indeed, whether by pen or sword, order or chaos, the Brujah may develop a following, become a cult of personality, find a cause worth dying for, and start a revolution. Younger Brujah tend to exert their efforts towards mortal affairs, while older Brujah turn their gaze towards perhaps their greatest enemies, the Ventrue and the Camarilla itself. This approach to unlife defines most of the Anarchs' existence within these modern knights. But why are the Brujah like this? Why do they gotta run around changing the world, spinning the wheel of revolution all the time? Why do they hate the Ventrue and the Camarilla so much? And perhaps the most important question of all, what is the deal with Carthage? Well, my friend, in order to answer these questions, and so many others, we must start from the very beginning. Get comfortable, because I have one hell of a story to tell you, which begins with Chapter 1, Wine Cellar, 3 Coins, Dead King, Prehistoric Era. Our story begins with an old legend that takes place within the Second City before the first antediluvian uprising. I'll give a brief recap of events to better set the stage, and those among you already familiar with what I'm talking about can skip to the time on screen. So, quick recap. The first city of man, ruled by Cain the first vampire, is flooded by God during the Great Deluge after the first city starts overflowing with more vampires than humans, more sin than righteousness. So the Great Flood washes the earth free of sin, though Cain and his second, third, and perhaps even fourth and fifth generation progeny survive due to their immortal curse. The vampires of the second generation, Enosh the Wise, Irad the Strong, and Scylla the Beautiful, are left to fend for themselves when Cain refuses to return to the world of the living. So Enosh, Irad, and Scylla find the mortal children of Noah and establish rule over them. They create the second city in hopes of recreating Cain's paradise within the first city. Enosh, Irad, and Scylla each form a number of broods in remembrance of Cain, which is typically believed to have numbered in 13 total vampires of the third generation, some of which were embraced before the flood, and all of which are remembered as the Antediluvians. Of course, watch the Cain and Lilith vid for a more in-depth breakdown. Okay, so our story begins within the second city, shortly after Cain leaves his children behind to fend for themselves. One of Cain's grandchilder, a third-generation antediluvian embraced by either Irad or Enosh, has recently awoken from his immortal torpor for the first time since the flood itself. However, unlike his consanguineous siblings, this antediluvian has awoken with a thirst far more powerful and terrible. This antediluvian, whose name has been lost to time, is remembered to us now under the title of Ilias, or simply Brujah. Ilias makes his way to a local mortal wine cellar within the second city, who formally recognizes and welcomes Brujah to his tent and his wares. The wine cellar addresses the Brujah antediluvian by his true name, which seems to agitate the Cainite. Whether out of madness or a cruel sense of humor, Ilias falsely corrects the wine cellar and claims his name to instead be Malkav, the brother of Brujah and the antediluvian of the Malkavians. The wine seller, confused and terrified, mistakenly attempts to correct Ilias. He says, "Are you sure, master? For I've seen your face before, and I am almost certain that when we met, you introduced yourself as Brujah, or Ilias." In response to the wine seller so foolishly questioning him, Brujah grows even more angry. He calls the wine seller a dirty lout and corrects him, though instead of claiming his name to be Malkav, Brujah contradicts himself once again, and instead claims to be Arikal, the purported antediluvian of Clan Toreador. So, still unsure if Brujah is fucking with him or not, the wine seller challenges the Cainite's claims once again. He basically says, "Wait, first you claim to be Malkav, now you claim to be Arikal, who I'm pretty sure is actually a woman." Brujah then curses the wine seller, rips his head off, and drinks his blood. He then takes the wine seller's entire stock of wine and leaves behind double the amount of what it was worth, so that the wine seller's newly widowed wife can pay rent. The end. That, my friend, is the tale of Brujah and the wine cellar, one of the few tales that exists regarding Ilias. So, what was the moral of that story, and what does it attempt to say about the Brujah as a whole? If you ask me, then simply put, this story is a cautionary metaphor of what the Brujah represents to those outside of the clan. Wherever a Brujah goes, blood, disorder, and a perverted sense of justice usually follows. Either Ilias was a madman who killed an innocent wine seller over nothing, or he was an egotistical bastard who felt like giving a random mortal a hard time, perhaps to make a point. But regardless, to most outside of the clan, this story is less of a mythical fable and more of a "holy shit, did you hear what Ilias did?" kind of gossip. But to the Brujah themselves, this story is just that. The wine seller is just a human in Brujah's way, a human stupid enough to question an antediluvian, and Ilias made up for it by paying double. The world can always find another wine cellar. The next two fables of Ilias are more often shared within the clan, and they paint him in a much better light. Most outside of the clan write these stories off as nothing more than revisionist bias attempting to make Ilias look good. In the tale referred to as Brujah and the Three Coins, a destitute stonemason is unable to pay legal fees to his local magistrate. Brujah, perhaps out of pity, pays for the man's legal fees with 3 coins, one of justice, one of fairness, and one of virtue. The rest of the story has also been lost to time, but this parable is often used to highlight Ilias as a fair and just being as opposed to monstrous and rebellious. Not only does he go out of his way to pay for some random poor man's plight, he probably took it to a whole new level, talking about righteousness and fairness, and probably how the stonemason is just as important as the magistrate. But regardless, The final, mostly incomplete parable painting Brujah in a good light is known as Brujah and the Dead King. In this tale, Brujah prevents a nameless city from succumbing to total anarchy after he finds and declares a new heir to the throne, since the former king met an untimely death. The rest of this story has also been lost to time. So, first Ilias is pissed off and irrational, and now he's all logical and righteous, changing laws and overstepping regulations as he sees fit. Regardless of whatever I or any other nodist tells you, the truth is, like all other antediluvians, these stories must be taken with a planet-sized grain of salt. And for every story told of Ilias being a terrifying little shit doing all this rebel nonsense, you get another story of a wise, albeit callous man who knew what was best for the people. If you ask me, I believe that the Brujah antediluvian was a once wrathful and monstrous figure, as depicted in The Wine Cellar, who would eventually learn to tame himself into a stoic sort of philosophical nature as seen in 3 Coins and Dead King. Brujah had to perhaps let himself become monstrous in order to learn how to tame and temper himself like steel, becoming some extreme embodiment of tough love. I say this because just about every single account eventually depicts Ilias and his vampiric offspring as a, at least for a time, philosophical, poetic, and historical warrior class of vampires, albeit with a reputation of being dispassionate, callous, and brutally logical. Most of these ancient Brujah possessed enough wisdom to quite literally see forward in time. This should be quite interesting to those among you whose understanding of the Brujah stops after the words vampire punks. Chapter 2. The Usurper. Prehistoric Era. There is a figure just as mysterious as Ilias despite being far more infamous. Even the very gender of the figure that we're to discuss is still widely debated, though I will refer to her as a woman throughout the rest of the video. This figure was none other than Troil, or Troile, a progeny of Ilias embraced either before or after the flood. And I gotta say, Ratz seriously outdid himself this time with the art depicting Ilias and Troil. He came to me with this badass idea involving a Meso or Assyrian or Sumer inspired backdrop, essentially, depicting the antediluvians Jyhad, Enosh, and Scylla. Just saying, art looks beautiful. It definitely has to be on a wallpaper somewhere at some point in my time. Mark my words, I'm gonna turn this into a wallpaper one day. Anyway, Troil's exploits are much more in line with the idea of the vampire punk archetype that we've seen in these modern knights. Her short temper was a legendary contrast to the composed and cold nature of Ilias. What Troil might have called passion, you and I would most certainly call fury. But this temper aside, an even greater legend surrounds our fiery Troil during an event that would perhaps doom the entirety of Clan Brujah for the rest of time. You see, at some point after Cain curses the antediluvians for the killing of the second generation during the first antediluvian uprising, Troil diablerizes Ilias, thus violently inheriting the title and power of Antediluvian of Clan Brujah. This event is widely accepted to have kickstarted the second Antediluvian uprising, in which the 4th and 5th generation Methuselah drove away the remaining Antediluvians before leaving the second city and spreading across the world at large. The reasoning for Troil diablerizing Ilias is mostly lost to time, with most accounts claiming that Troil was simply one rebellious Brujah that, perhaps in a fit of rage, cannibalized her sire for his power. One account claims that Troil diablerized Ilias for her own safety. The idea is that Troil was embraced after Cain forbade the antediluvians from ever performing the embrace again, and since she was unable to read Ilias's emotions and intent, she was unable to tell if Ilias planned on disposing of her, given her blasphemous existence, hence the diablerie. Another account states that Troil is actually a manifestation of the curse cast upon the Brujah antediluvian by Cain. Since Ilias was a being who lived by revolution, he would be doomed to quite literally be eaten by it. One more radical claim suggests Ilias is Troil. The diablerie never happened, and Ilias instead faked his own death in order to kickstart the second antediluvian uprising, for he perhaps foresaw such a future using his superior wisdom over time. A similar claim states that, as Troil attempted to diablerize her sire, Brujah used his mastery and wisdom over time itself to quite literally hurl himself forward several thousand years into the future, right into the garden of none other than Lilith herself. Not even joking, but that's a story for another video. Our final claim states that the Ventrue antediluvian and his kind actually offed Ilias, and then blamed it on Brujah infighting in order for the Ventrue to shed the blame while also forever sealing the Brujah's fate as a vampire punks. Which, while not true, is peak Ventrue propaganda right there. Some kindred archaeologists believe that the very sword used by Troial to strike down her sire can be found in some blocked-off chasm among the slopes of Mount Athos in Greece. The sword itself is described as being forged of crystal and splinters of stone, rather than metal. The length and weight of the blade was said to be heavy enough such that mortals could only wield it with both hands. Some claim the very essence of the antediluvian the sword had struck down had become mystically bound to the blade, and could even be tapped into, though at great cost to the wielder. Perhaps this could give credence to the idea that Troial did in fact diablerize Ilias, thus usurping the title and power of Antediluvian of Clan Brujah. On the topic of that sword, by the way, when attempting to figure out why the Sword of Troial was found in Mount Athos, Greece of all places, I went on this whole deep dive reading about Greek mythology and the giants, and as it turns out, simply put, the White Wolf Wiki already came to the same conclusions that I did, and they worded it way better than I ever could, so I'm just going to read from it directly. Given that the sword is said to be on Mount Athos, it's worth noting that Athos in Greek mythology is the name of one of the giants that challenged the Greek gods during the Gigantomachia. As one interpretation of the story goes, Athos threw a massive rock against Poseidon, which fell into the Aegean Sea and became Mount Athos. While the story isn't a perfect parallel to Ilias and Troial, I think you can make out some similarities. This tale is only exacerbated by our next story regarding Brujah history, during an event remembered by the Ventrue as the First Brujah War. But before we get to that, and all these theories aside, the ultimate takeaway is this. Our rebellious Troial usurped the Brujah, maybe Cain curses Troial with being forever temperamental as punishment, and now the vampire punks have been unleashed into the night, forever cursed to warp history by spinning the wheels of revolution, just as their founders did. We will never know the true story of what actually happened between Troial and Ilias, though there is one group of sages that holds the truth, even if they refuse to share it. Chapter 3. The Division of Blood. Prehistoric Era. It is widely agreed that Troial was not the only Brujah embraced by Ilias, despite some accounts claiming otherwise. One account claims that Ilias embraced Troial in the heat of the moment, for the two were lovers. The second claim matches the first, though the two were not lovers. Perhaps Troial was just an interesting contrast to Ilias's emotionless and withdrawn nature. But I digress. As I mentioned a moment ago, most agree that Troial was not the only fourth-generation Brujah that existed by the time of Ilias's diablerie. After the usurpation of the clan, all of those vampires embraced by Troial going forward wore the title of Brujah. Those few remaining kindred originally embraced by Ilias, however, call themselves the true Brujah. Few have ever come in contact with the true Brujah, for they have remained almost entirely hidden from the world ever since the Usurper diablerized their sire. Most reports that speak of the true Brujah also mention the true Brujah's affiliation with the elusive yet widely feared organization known as the Black Hand, or the Tal Mahera, which is a tale for a different time. Reports on the true Brujah make it pretty clear that they share the personality of their sire Ilias down to a T, which should explain their limited numbers and elusive nature. Simply put, they are the exact opposite of their loud and proud vampire punk sister clan, the Brujah. As a matter of fact, the true Brujah's clan bane causes them to lose most of their emotional capacity after their embrace. As time passes, their ability to feel sympathy or empathy simply withers away, until they're entirely freed from the burden of feelings and emotions at the cost of their humanity. Couple this vampiric psychosociopathy with an obsession for knowledge, and you have yourself a true Brujah. This clanbane doesn't mean that the Truha are destined to devolve into a rabid animal or a wight due to their lost humanity, however. They instead transition into a cold lizard brain mindset that thinks and acts with a warped sense of purpose. Some claim that the reasoning behind the true Brujah's lack of emotion comes from the simple fact that emotions stand in the way of truth. And what truths have the true Brujah uncovered? Well, why don't I tell you a little story and we'll see if you're able to pick up on the Truha's power. During a gathering of Brujah in an unknown Anarch free state in the 1950s, a woman stepped forward and claimed to be the child of the true Brujah. Anyone who fucked with her suddenly found themselves stuck in place, repeating their actions and inexplicably ending up right back where they started whenever they tried to approach her. Most Brujah who attended this meeting almost always refused to speak or even acknowledge the event happened. You and I could have attended this meeting as well, but neither of us can remember. It's like, thanks to the manipulation of time, it never happened. Alright, have you figured it out yet? You see, thanks to the true Brujah's wisdom of their undead state, they are capable of manipulating the very essence that keeps their undead bodies in eternal stasis, and have even learned to manipulate it. This discipline, known as Temporis, means that the true Brujah are basically friggin' emotionless vampire Time Lords. Remember that one account that claimed Ilias yeeted himself 1,000 years into the future after Troil attempted to diabolarize him? Well, Temporis is the reason why. Hell, you and I could have come in contact with and even been fed on by a true Brujah, but their mastery over our experience of time means that we'll simply never know or even remember. The true Brujah might only let us live today because they find us useful tomorrow. The exact number of true Brujah that remain within the world of darkness is unknown, though it is believed to be fewer than 100, possibly even fewer than 50. Some among them actively conspire against the false children of the Usurper, while others remain loyal to the Black Hand. There's honestly a lot more to talk about when it comes to the Truha, but it's all a story for another time. Just understand that for everything else we're to discuss moving forward, a Truha was probably somewhere in the mix, typically watching and judging their Brujah sister clan from afar. And as for the Usurpers themselves, well, let's just say they made many, many more mistakes for the true Brujah to judge. Chapter 4. The First Brujah War, roughly 430 BC. After the Second Antediluvian Uprising, many of those Brujah who scattered across the globe tried to recreate the Second City, a utopia where kindred would be worshipped as gods and coexist peacefully with the descendants of Cain and Seth. Most of these attempts utterly failed and were lost into obscurity, though one of the earliest known attempts occurred in ancient Athens, Greece, around 430 years before Christ. Here, the Brujah nurtured their vision of a new second city among the orators and philosophers. Over time, Athens became a place in which kindred existed openly and freely among the kind. It was most likely around this time that the Sword of Troil found itself within Greece. This experiment quickly drew the attention of the Ventrue from neighboring Sparta, who were simply appalled by the Brujah's audacity. In the eyes of the Ventrue, the Usurper clan was entirely unworthy of claiming the glory of Cain, especially while coexisting with equals with the living. Couple that with the Brujah's brashness, ignorance, and lack of organization standing in complete contrast with the Ventrue, whose entire existence was dedicated to leading both the living and the dead, and, well, rivalry and conflict would soon begin. Over time, this conflict brewed between the two immortal clans, and soon their influence began to overlap. Some believe this conflict would ultimately set the stage for the Peloponnesian Wars between Athens and Sparta, though the Ventrue remember this era as the First Brujah War. When the Ventrue struck down and drove away the Athenian Brujah, most of the Brujah themselves followed Troil's example, diabolarized their sires, and left no witnesses to their failed attempt at a second city. Now only the Ventrue acknowledge the First Brujah War, while most Brujah don't even recognize it. As a matter of fact, the First Brujah War isn't even mentioned in Clanbook Brujah Revised, only Clanbook Ventrue. But make no mistake, the Brujah were not deterred from fulfilling their dreams of recreating the Second City. Within the span of roughly 200 years, the Brujah continued to push south from Greece and Rome, cross the Mediterranean Sea, and perform a feat so great that it would redefine the clan's history forever.
My son, stand before the gods and swear, from this day until your last, that you will always be an enemy of Rome.
Chapter 5. The Third City, 650 to 146 BC. Carthage, once called Carthage, was a once thriving North African city-port founded by Phoenician settlers from neighboring Tyre around the 9th century before Christ. By 600 BC, it had grown into a powerful and prosperous city-state within the Phoenician network. It also served as one of the most important places and times in history for many kindred, especially the Brujah. Most Brujah speak of Carthage as, for a time, a utopia, where vampires and humans coexisted peacefully and without issue. Many vampires, especially the Brujah, idealize Carthage as a once perfect vampiric city-state free from the restrictions of what we now call the Masquerade. Carthage, at least for a time, was indeed a wonderful city of eternal harmony, peace, and progress. Most Brujah, however, blame the Ventrue, namely Roman Ventrue, for its eventual destruction. Others speak of a terrifying demonic influence that was responsible for the city's horrific downfall. Indeed, many accounts claim that by the time the Romans brought about the fall of Carthage during the Third Punic War in roughly 146 BC, the place was anything but a utopia. The prominent religion of the land, like most other Phoenician states, was that of Baalism. This religion degenerated the once prosperous city-state into as some rumors put it, a pit of human sacrifice that hosted nightly bloodbaths and orgies, a place where slaves, children, and women were sacrificed to the infernal alongside all other manners of demonic rites and luxurious indulgence. But let's not jump too far ahead. Carthage, at its peak, attracted all types of kindred, though the Brujah would be quick to inform you that they were the most prominent and influential clan within the city. Phoenician Banu Hakim and even a number of Ventrue came in second to the Brujah's dominance. The city itself served as a haven for many legendary vampires, including the Brujah Methuselah Menelaus, or Menela, the child of Troil. Now, the reason that Menela looks like the lead singer of Typo Negative, Peter Steele, the late and great Peter Steele, is for you to figure out. As the story goes, Troil, who wandered endlessly after the fall of the Second City, eventually came across Menelaus, Scholar King of Sparta, who she found captivating. Indeed, this would be the very same Menelaus of Sparta, husband to Helen of Troy, as seen within the Iliad and Odyssey. I'm just going to put it plainly, not only did the events told within Iliad and Odyssey more or less actually happen within the world of darkness, most of those people within those stories are actually immortal vampires, some of which are still around to this very night. But I digress. After spending months in conversation, the antediluvian Troil deemed Menelaus worthy of immortality and embraced him. Then, at some unknown point in time, hundreds of years after his embrace, Menela became aware of the fabled city of Carthage and even established a haven there. He would then begin traveling the world, seeking those wise living and dead in order to bring them to Carthage. Several hundred years later, in 423 BC, Menela took interest in an influential mortal philosopher residing in Athens, Greece, named Critias. The nature of Critias' embrace by Menelaus is perhaps known only to them, though some believe Menelaus approached the Athenian after his popular teachings led to his exile. Menela confronted Critias within a bathhouse, used the discipline Dominate to keep the human calm, and then the two debated their philosophies until the sun rose. Impressed, Menela offered Critias immortality, and he gladly accepted. When Critias eventually made his way to Carthage, he established a Socratic school and became one of the most influential Brujah within the city. Another Athenian philosopher, Xenophon the historian, also found his way to Carthage after his embrace, though it is uncertain if Menela was his sire. Dido, the mortal queen and founder of Carthage itself, was also embraced into Clan Brujah and continued to reside in the city. So too might have been the case for the legendary Hannibal, the famous mortal general who commanded the forces of Carthage during the Second Punic War against the Romans. Hannibal's case is intriguing in that some believe he was a direct child of Troil herself, like Menelaus, or Menela, while others deny his existence in unlife entirely. One could spend hours recounting the number of legendary mortals and immortals who not only found themselves embraced into the Clan Brujah, but also established influence within Carthage as well. However, despite the presence of so many powerful and influential undead, or perhaps because of it, Carthage would gradually succumb to the will of those who sought its ultimate destruction. Many factors contributed to the events leading to the Punic Wars and the fall of Carthage, an era remembered by the Ventrue as the Second Brujah War. Most Roman Ventrue would tell you that they would have gladly ignored Carthage, had it not been for the Brujah's ever-growing boldness with conquering neighboring realms and committing increasingly deranged acts of depravity. Who knows what would have happened had Carthage not been stopped? Conspiracy and corruption, driven in part by the ambitions of Greece and Rome, led to the city's political and economic degeneration, reducing it to a series of squabbling forums vying for control. By the time of the Punic Wars, the city's coffers had dried up, and some claim that the immortal rulers of the land instead spent their final nights partying and holding orgies with both the living and the dead. They couldn't afford war, so might as well go down with the ship in good spirits. Despite the presence of commanders of renown like Hannibal at the Gate or Dominic of Carthage, the city simply had no chance of surviving any war. Menela himself left the city and pushed south to seek the aid of the Nosferatu and Gangrel of the region. However, by the time he returned, he was too late. Some claim that Menela's legendary immortal rival, Helena, led the Romans to destroy Carthage. This would be the very same Helen of Troy that used to be married to Menelaus in life. As the story goes, Helena, a Methuselah of Clan Toreador and former lover of Menelaus, came to reside in glorious Carthage alongside her ghoul lover Prius. Other sources claim Helena was invited here by Menela, who was seeking allies for Carthage during the Punic Wars. By the time of Carthage's fall, as the Roman Ventrue surrounded the city, Helena quickly adopted the idea that the city was a lost cause, and so she defected to the Roman invaders surrounding the city. She gave them important weak points and strategies on how to better conquer it. Helena's extremely powerful ghoul lover, the aforementioned Prius, bound by blood to Helena, was forced to defect alongside her. Some claim that Helena and Prius themselves directly led the Roman charge and final siege that led to the fall of Carthage itself. As a reward for her defection, the Ventrue Romans would grant Helena the fiefdom of Pompeii, and in time Helena and Prius would make their exodus to their newly granted lands, where they would spend the next century or so in hopes of distancing themselves from their horrific actions of the past. When Menela witnessed the ruins of his once beloved city, his devastation brought him to forgo civilization entirely, and he disappeared into the wilds of Eastern Europe for centuries to come. Meanwhile, one mortal man was so pissed off at the destruction of such a sacred place that he demanded to be turned into a vampire on the very night of Carthage's fall. This man was known as Dominic of Carthage, a Brujah of the 6th generation and great-grandchild of Troil. Though the Brujah who sired Dominic perished in the fires of Carthage, Dominic himself used his newfound vampirism to fend off scores of Roman Ventrue for entire days and nights, until he eventually collapsed into torpor. Fortunately, a number of Carthaginians recovered his body, preventing it from succumbing to ash like the rest of the city. Dominic, who fell into torpor with a raging hatred for the Ventrue and Romans, would not wake up for the next 700 years. The fall of Carthage itself marked a catastrophic loss for the Brujah. Carthaginian kindred and kind fled as the city erupted in flame. The Romans themselves salted the earth of the land they conquered, and the city never regained its once legendary idyllic state. Following the Third Punic War, Carthage fell completely into Roman hands and deteriorated over the centuries until it was nothing more than ruins. It's hard for me to put into words just what was lost beyond the city itself. The razing of Carthage left a permanent scar on the kindred of Clan Brujah that's still felt to this very night. They didn't just lose the jewel of the Mediterranean, they were essentially stripped of a cultural heart and ideological stronghold. The city was tangible proof, to them at least, that an alternative to the silence of blood imposed by other clans was possible, that the Second City could come back. Its loss meant the extinguishing of a dream that showcased a different path for kindred society, one that theoretically would value liberty, equality, and the potential for coexistence. There are still kindred who secretly work to recreate the glory of Carthage and achieve coexistence with the children of Cain and Seth, even to this very night. These kindred, which are primarily Brujah, are known as the Prometheans. Unsurprisingly, Prometheans are walking, talking masquerade breaches, forcing them to exist as a hidden cult, hunted by both the living and the dead. Ironically, their longing for coexistence and prosperity has led to their vilification and silencing by both sides, and so they continue to work in secret, forever failing to recreate what could never be. So there you have it. One of the more Brujah-centric explanations of Carthage, which is commonly shared among most of the Brujah as of tonight. And while there is a great deal of truth to this romanticized tale of tragedy, the Romans' claims of demonic influence were far from exaggerated. And while most like myself would hate to admit it, the Romans and the Ventrue may have been right to destroy the city. Carthage had something to hide. The city of Carthage attracted all manner of kindred, though perhaps none more foul than the demon known as Moloch of Clan Baali, who saw the wealth and riches of Carthage as the perfect garden for his misdeeds. We won't discuss the extensive history of Moloch and the Baali in this video, but know this. The Baali were a bloodline of extremely vile, demon-worshipping vampires, Moloch being one of the first of their kind. By the time Moloch set his sights on Carthage, he already established himself as one of the most dangerous vampires walking the night. Chapter 6. The Shadow over Carthage. Most Brujah would tell you that they were the premier clan orchestrating Carthage behind the scenes, but this is simply not the truth. The Baali were the ultimate shadow cast over Carthage. Moloch's manipulations started relatively minor. He presented himself as a wise man and advisor to the Brujah. It was Moloch who presented the idea of ghouling war elephants into Hannibal's legendary army. It was Moloch who propagated the idea of Brujah supremacy and of draining and embracing mortals as the Brujah saw fit, regardless of the mortals' consent. It was Moloch who subtly influenced the idea that nothing was off the table if it meant immortalizing Carthage's legacy. In time, Brujah, both young and old, sought the aid of the Baali for power, influence, acclaim, anything they wanted. Moloch and his Baali subtly and deliberately desensitized the Brujah to the ever-growing brutality of their strange ways. In time, Moloch was revered by Carthage as a godlike figure, remembered as Moloch Baal Haman. The Baali's plan worked out almost too well. The children of Troil were utterly blinded by their dream of Carthage. However, unfortunately, any hope that the Brujah might be saved from complete corruption vanished when Troil herself became a lover to Moloch Baal Haman. Indeed, Troil the Usurper was present during the Knights of Carthage, though the antediluvian did not rule from the forefront like most other Brujah, instead seemingly operating from behind the scenes. There is a reason why I failed to mention Troil's presence in Carthage up to this point. When Baal Haman began demanding the mortals sacrifice their children to him, Troil begrudgingly turned a blind eye, as did the other Brujah. It was all in the name of the city's good fortune after all. When limbs and organs were cast into great Baali wells, Troil and her kind turned a blind eye still. Troil despised the presence of the Baali and their growing influence within Carthage, though not even she could deny their usefulness. Despite this, Moloch's demonic charm simply couldn't be ignored by Troil, and over the centuries, the two developed a strange rapport. Moloch encouraged, nurtured, and cultivated the darker aspects within Troil, and in time convinced her to succumb to the antediluvian's thirst, also known as the Thirst of Ages, or the Thirst of Cain. Troil would no longer be satiated by mortal blood, and soon only the blood of other vampires was capable of sustaining her. In time, Moloch and Troil would feast upon the dead with each other behind closed doors, growing ever more closer. As more centuries passed, Troil degenerated to a point where she regularly embraced mortals just to exsanguinate them. Moloch had no trouble talking Troil into even greater acts of perversion and degeneration, and soon even she was present in the rituals of human child sacrifice to Moloch Baal Haman. As the centuries passed, Troil stopped fighting the corruption, and soon the Baali celebrated her evolution. By the time Troil realized Moloch's true intentions, it was too late. As it turns out, the antediluvian's thirst was a mere ruse to establish a blood bond between Troil and Moloch. And once that blood bond was established, Moloch claimed the antediluvian as his lover. It was then that the dream of Carthage devolved into a nightmare. By the time the Romans put Carthage to the torch during the Third Punic War, Troil was empty from within. Her humanity and conscience were gone, and while most vampires would have succumbed to their beast and become a wight, she was simply a quiet, hollow shell of her former self. The rest of Clan Brujah, her own childhood, abandoned her. The Brujah were ashamed of all that they had done in the name of Carthage, blaming the Romans and the Baali for the crimes of humanity as they fled their burning city. Perhaps the Baali are to blame. Then again, perhaps the Baali simply showed the Brujah who they truly were. Yet, amazingly, rather than succumb to the torch and salt of the Romans, Troil put up one final stand to protect everything she sacrificed herself for. Legend goes, as Troil fought off scores of Roman soldiers and the vampires supporting them, Moloch was compelled to fight beside her. Despite Moloch's blood bond holding total control over Troil, it seems her legendary temper and passion was enough to bring Moloch to heel. A better way to put it, Troil got so damn mad that an incarnation of the devil himself could no longer keep her on his leash any longer. Moloch could not hide behind the scenes anymore like a serpent little bitch. It was time he faced his transgressions by the sword. Other sources simply claim that Moloch ran to his lover's aid during their final stand out of true love, but, well, I don't know, fuck that. During Moloch and Troil's final stand against the Romans, Baali reports claim that Moloch got absolutely wiped out because my boy put all of his points in intrigue and none of them in martial or prowess. As Moloch was struck down, Troil took the demon into her arms, and the two reportedly sank deep into the earth at the center of Carthage. Even the Baali were able to save Moloch, but they just saw their demon god king get his ass beat by a bunch of Romans, and so they laughed and watched as they sank into the earth. Roman La Sombra salted the earth and used rituals to prevent any undead, infernal or otherwise, from ever rising from the hallowed grounds of Carthage ever again. The hatred of the Baali by the Brujah can still be felt to this very night, and in fact, some believe that the Brujah's clan bane of their uncontrollable rage actually comes from remembering the pain endured by Troil within Carthage, passed through the children of her blood. The Baali smile at this proposition, for they know what even older Brujah and true Brujah know. The Brujah prostituted their values and ethics for power, legend, and to sustain a dream that could never be maintained. As for Moloch and Troil, the two allegedly remain entangled and buried deep underneath the soil of modern Tunisia, where their corruption continues to be felt to this very night. Most kindred who walk on the lands of Tunisia are driven into a severe rot trek just by walking upon the salted earth, a terrible reminder of the horrors of the past.
Oh, you're
Carthage.
dying. Oh, man. Oh. Do you have any problems at all?
Chapter 7. Eternal City, Eternal Grudge. 146 BC to 476 AD. The immediate history of Clan Brujah following the fall of Carthage remains largely unknown. Most Brujah met their final death at the hands of the Romans, leaving only a handful of survivors. Some of these survivors allowed themselves to be subjugated by the Roman Empire and the oppressive rule of the Ventrue Senate that oversaw it. Perhaps these Brujah sought to make amends with the atrocities they partook of within Carthage. Other Brujah fled as far west as the British Isles. The remaining Brujah developed a deep hatred towards Rome and the Ventrue Senate that ruled over it, and so they directed their efforts to destroy Rome just as the Romans destroyed Carthage. This was the case for our wise Critias, who was exploring the world seeking more allies for Carthage by the time of its destruction, much like his sire, Menelaus. There, said it right. Upon witnessing the salted ruins of his antediluvian's newfound tomb, the enraged Critias, perhaps with other Brujah in his tow, turned his vengeful gaze upon Rome itself. Hannibal simply disappeared after the fall of Carthage. Perhaps he perished, perhaps he gave it all up. Then again, perhaps this Methuselah never existed in the first place. Regardless of which Brujah went where, their war against the Eternal City had begun. In the earlier days of this vengeance-fueled guerrilla war, Critias and his kind would attempt to stoke rebellion among farmers and landowners within Rome and other parts of Italy, to ultimately no avail. If anything, these earlier conflicts only served to bring the Brujah to the Ventrue's attention. Minor insurgencies like this defined a bulk of the earlier stands against the Romans. Critias himself would play a major part in the events that would lead to the conflict of the Mithridatic Wars, even personally leading a number of armies during the nearly 3-decade conflict. At some point, the war drove Critias into a state of frenzy that lasted for 3 nights straight, with the Methuselah only coming to his senses after he found himself exsanguinating the blood of an innocent girl. Mortified by what he did, Critias fled to a neighboring city, where he witnessed nearly 80,000 Roman civilians butchered by Critias' own armies. The terror of witnessing this destruction caused Critias to sink deep within the earth. His troops continued to carry out their own terrible savageries. It had been nearing a century since the fall of Carthage, yet still did the Brujah find themselves committing atrocities in its name. It would take centuries of effort before the Brujah played their own key part in the political, economic, and social degradation of Rome. About a century and a half after the Mithridatic Wars, Menela, who spent the last few centuries shunning civilization, learns of a beautiful toreador ruling over the Roman fiefdom of Pompeii. He immediately suspects this toreador to be Helena, and in a fit of rage, Menela breaks his vow of seclusion and marches towards Pompeii. On the night that he visits Pompeii, his suspicions were confirmed. Helena indeed ruled over the city. As the legend goes, this discovery sent Menela into his first frenzy in 1,000 years, resulting in the fiery destruction of Pompeii and the eruption of Mount Vesuvius. The mountain erupted thanks to Menela using thaumaturgic rituals to call forth a fiery spirit from deep within the mountain, and you probably know what happens next. The entire city is destroyed, and Menela finds himself surviving only by casting himself into the harbor. Amazingly, and unfortunately for Menela, both Helena and her ghoul lover Prius would survive. This event, among many others, was part of a feud between Menela and Helena that would continue to last even to this very night. By the era preceding Rome's destruction, not even the Ventrue held control over the once glorious empire. With few exceptions, the ever-emerging presence of Christianity and Catholicism had long driven out most supernaturals from establishing any long-term presence or control from within, despite the attempts of so many. Regardless of which direction the Ventrue went after the fall of Rome, the Brujah followed closely. When Rome fell 622 years after the fall of Carthage, the Brujah's lust for vengeance had yet to be satiated. Chapter 8. Pen and Sword. 476 to the 10th century, over 620 years after the fall of Carthage. After the fall of the Roman Empire, most kindred followed the lead of the kine, and spread about the world, degenerating into centuries of barbarism that gave way to the Dark Ages. The Brujah were no exception, and for a time, history violently repeated itself on a never-ending cycle. Kingdoms rose and fell, lands and people were taken and forgotten. Religions like Christianity spread across Europe, causing vampires to slowly lose their grip over the living. Education became an arduous luxury. Most Brujah completely succumbed to a way of living defined exclusively by conquering and destroying in an attempt to carve out their own immortal legacy. Others continued to conquer and butcher in the name of Carthage. This was the case for one infamous Brujah remembered as Dominic, who had finally risen from his torpor roughly 650 years after his final stand within Carthage. When Dominic awoke, the first thing he did was grab a sword and look for some Romans to kill. But after learning that Rome had been destroyed roughly 35 years prior to his awakening, he redirected his rage towards the Ventrue responsible for Carthage's destruction. Dominic gathered bands of pre-Hungarian Magyar barbarians and campaigned against the Ventrue ruling along the Mediterranean. Soon Dominic would establish himself as an infamous Brujah warlord and a relentless menace to the Ventrue. His quest for retribution would, in time, become legend, and he would continue to campaign along the Mediterranean like this for the next 500 years. Meanwhile, to the western lands of Ireland, we have Clara and Fergal. You see, not every Brujah from the early Dark Ages secured their legacy as conquerors and warlords. Some Brujah witnessed the members of their clan tearing each other apart and went all Brujah about it, going against their clan's status quo. This was the case for two particularly learned and philosophical Irish Brujah that some jokingly claim put an end to the ceaseless cycle of conflict. The first Brujah, Clara of Cork, devoted herself to the church and its resources, not in favor of God, but for the betterment of man. She used her influence to establish a clergy in an unknown place within the British Isles and devoted it strictly to the cataloging, writing, and copying of any and all historical texts before they could be swallowed by the never-ending conflict. The second Brujah, Fergal the Pious, traveled all along the lands of Eastern and Western Europe, portions of Northern Africa, and even parts of the Far East in pursuit of written texts worthy of preservation. These two kindred understood that history was doomed to repeat itself forever. If Rome and Carthage could fall, then certainly nothing was safe. They wished to see a world, a culture, in which man could learn from the mistakes of his ancestors. Their efforts were so successful that the church's presence within the British Isles could soon not be paralleled, and entire libraries documenting the past slowly gave way to a new world of thought. Some jokingly claim that without Clara and Fergal's centuries of effort, the Dark Ages may have lasted forever. Yet, not all remember Clara and Fergal in such a good light. Had they not intervened with the humanity in such a powerful way, perhaps the humans wouldn't have ever been given a chance to rise up and drive vampires into hiding in the first place. But alas, the deed had been done. And don't get me wrong, nobody is claiming that Clara and Fergal were the only self-aware Brujah responsible for saving all of humanity by cataloging the past. It's just that their efforts are certainly not forgotten. Chapter 9. The First of the Anarchs, 10th to 13th centuries. Over 1150 years after the fall of Carthage. By the conclusion of the 10th century, roughly 520 years after the fall of Rome, Dominic's conquest had crushed or driven away the Ventrue to lands beyond his reach. My man spent the last half millennia running around tearing up Ventrue, yet it was still not enough. It was only inevitable that Dominic and his barbarian horde turned their attention towards Constantinople in pursuit of more Ventrue to kill. Before Dominic could storm the gates, the Patriarch of Constantinople, a Toreador Methuselah remembered as Archangel Michael, appeared before Dominic and offered him an alliance. As it turned out, Michael harbored his own ancient grudge against a certain Ventrue that dwelled within the lands north of Constantinople, and so the two made an accord. Dominic left Constantinople untouched and pushed north, where Michael and Dominic's Ventrue nemesis lay awaiting their final deaths. Dominic would strengthen his forces by enlisting other Brujah to his rank, and ghouling Magyar soldiers by the hundreds. Yet, of all the soldiers, mercenaries, and warriors under Dominic's banner, only the greatest of them was deemed worthy of Dominic's trust and embrace. This man, a ghoul remembered as Bolskew, was a Magyar chieftain who had been religiously devoted to Dominic's cause for nearly 20 to 30 years. On the night Bolscu was to be embraced by Dominic, the Ventrue, despised by Mikhail, came to Bolscu in his dreams and demonstrated to him true power. Not the power defined by that of a warlord, but that of a king. When Bolscu awoke, he drove a stake into Dominic's heart and was embraced by a member of Clan Ventrue. Before Dominic could be brought to his final death, his body was saved, though he would not awaken from his torpor for nearly 200 years. Bolscu, in the meantime, totally defected to the Ventrue, and would be partially responsible for establishing an army the Ventrue needed in order for them to establish their own control within the regions of modern Hungary and Romania. Meanwhile, by the year 1194, reports had begun to tell of one mortal crusader named Krzysztof Romuald, who was embraced into Clan Brujah somewhere in Prague. This would mark the beginning of an otherwise legendary set of adventures, all of which is explored in Vampire the Masquerade Redemption. After Dominic emerged from his 2-century torpor, he amassed his forces and continued his crusade against the Ventrue controlling the regions of Hungary and Romania, his hatred for Bolscu surpassing his eternal beef of Carthage. As the Golden Mongol horde swept across the land, the Ventrue found themselves cornered against the Carpathian Mountains, with Dominic following close behind. Soon, the Ventrue and the Brujah would be forced to face each other, and what better place for their confrontation than Transylvania? The mere mention of Transylvania, or even Hungary, usually conjures up images of the Semici, Nosferatu, and the most feral of gangrel. However, the truth is that by the 12th century, Hungarian Brujah were pretty much all over the place, perhaps even rivaling the populations of those other aforementioned clans. But because they were not the indigenous kindred of the, quote, land beyond the forest, as most only came here alongside Dominic in the pursuit of the Ventrue, perhaps the rural clans forced the Brujah into relative obscurity. Oh, and of course, by the time the Mongol horde was tearing up Eurasia, you already know for damn sure that a ton of Brujah rode alongside the Gangrel Anda that I talked about in the Gangrel video. Dominic's forces would continue to grow into a sizable army of rebels, both living and dead, almost all of whom were turned into 6th-generation ghouls. To put things in perspective, a 6th-generation human ghoul has basically the potential to be just as powerful as a 13th-generation vampire. So we're talking about angry, pissed-off Hungarian raiders strong enough to rip horses in half, with skin tough as stone, totally loyal to Dominic. Meanwhile, Dominic is exsanguinating so much blood that he was able to somehow maintain this army of superhuman ghouls. The Brujah and their barbarians clashed with the Ventrue and their Holy Roman Empire puppets for control over the domains of Transylvania. Meanwhile, the native Semici just wanted both clans exiled from their homeland. Dominic was not waging a glorious crusade or a grand war against the Ventrue. He wasn't even here to fight them. Dominic was here simply to kill them. His armies only served to position himself in a way that allowed him to deliver a swift, wordless, final death. Dominic's reliance on mercenaries, guerrilla tactics, and ghoul soldiers earned him many infamous titles, from the Brute Patriarch to the Mercenary Overlord. At some point in time, he began to use methods of brutality that even some Semici would find impressive. The Ventrue and Semici had never been struck down so ruthlessly in Transylvania. For years, their control and influence over the land was nearly absolute. Word of Dominic and his forces spread quickly across the land. He inadvertently demonstrated that indeed, the immortal tyrants of the Semici and Ventrue could be struck down. It didn't take long for Brujah rebellions to propagate throughout the neighboring regions, openly rebelling and combating any kindred structure put in place. Elder vampires began to hide themselves away in their well-fortified havens of castles, manors, and crypts. All that being said, the Brujah's dominance of the lands they conquered was far from glorious. They did not establish a grand empire reminiscent of the Second City or of Carthage. This was something different. If the Brujah couldn't raise an empire, then it seems nobody could. If glory couldn't be found from creating a utopia, then the Brujah would find glory ensuring dystopia. As Dominic reasoned, if you could not win the game, change the rules. Transylvania became a realm seemingly defined by vampiric anarchy, where only the strongest thrived and where every kindred ruled over themselves or followed the strongest in their wake. The land remained a nearly lawless frontier and war zone that attracted all manner of kindred, both young and old. Any who crossed into the land beyond the forest understood that only death or glory lay claim to them. The Tzimisce, Ventrue, and even Nosferatu of the region struggled to maintain control from the Brujah raiders and pillagers, and for a time, even the Tzimisce would work alongside the Ventrue to drive away the Brujah. As more time would pass, even native Tzimisce themselves began to openly rebel and even diabolarize their seemingly incapable sires. More and more vampires of the region became and soon the elder vampires of the region became indiscriminate machines of annihilation, smiting any and all foolish to ever stand against their wise and ancient authority. Despite all that happened in favor of the Brujah, Dominic had yet to deliver the killing blow to Bolscu, and those remaining Ventrue responsible for Carthage itself. Though the Ventrue were incapable of facing Dominic on his terms, they mastered using intrigue just to remain out of the barbarians' reach. Then, at some unknown point in time, perhaps within 100 years of Dominic's presence in Transylvania, Dominic would encounter a member of Clan Ravnos that spoke of a being who could help Dominic find the Ventrue he sought. This being, the Ravnos claimed, was known as Yorak, whose haven was located along the Carpathian Mountains themselves. When Dominic approached the haven of Yorak, what he witnessed was magnificent. It was a mighty cathedral, woven from bone, flesh, and skin, whose pillars were a conglomeration of grafted bodies, screaming and wailing in perfectly attuned harmony that heralded Dominic's approach. The walls cultivated their own organs and entrails, as though they were one single being, composed of many, an amalgamation of living biomass, architecturally shaped, yet organically composed. A place where the human form was to be sculpted and reshaped to fit the needs demanded of its owner, the Tzimisce Methuselah Yorak. Dominic stood before the Cathedral of Flesh, unaware that he would spend the next 700 years serving as its latest guest. Before Dominic could turn away, the Cathedral of Flesh swallowed him whole, and his metamorphosis began. Though Dominic disappeared, his legacy lived on. His army splintered apart and conquered territories far beyond Transylvania, leading entire countries' vampiric populations to go completely rogue against their elders and be remembered in time as Anarch Free States, where no single vampire upheld authority over another. Some say that it was the actions of a certain Wallachian voivod that would ultimately drive away the Brujah from Transylvania. The Ventrue, like Bolscu, upon their withdrawal from Transylvania, pushed further east to capitalize on the lack of control within the chaotic, war-torn land devastated by the Mongols, while others pushed westward. Soon, anarchist vampires from across Western and Eastern Europe would, either knowingly or unknowingly, follow Dominic's example, rejecting the traditions and embracing a do-as-thou-wilt attitude towards vampirism, while openly defying elder authority. Though the term Anarch wouldn't be coined for another couple hundred years, many look back on Dominic as not only the brute patriarch or Promethean warlord, but as the first of the Anarchs. By the 12th and 13th centuries, mortals en masse had begun their inquisition against all heresy that stood in the face of God. kindred especially. This resulted in elder vampires using their blood-bonded progeny as cannon fodder to use against the Inquisition in order to protect themselves. Naturally, these progeny developed a hatred towards their sires for being treated like expendable assets. And in time, these younger vampires had begun to overthrow, diabolarize, or otherwise rebel against their elders en masse. Confidence among other would-be revolutionaries spread like wildfire with each successful rebellion, and things were only made more interesting as more and more kindred gained access to the Valdery, a ritual which allowed one to sever their blood bond to their sire. While Dominic cannot be given all the credit for ushering forth this era of anarchist strife, many vampires from across the known world would be emboldened by his legacy. All of this in the name of retribution for the Ventrue's destruction of Carthage.
Okay, Brujah, you gotta get over it. It was 2,000 years ago. Carthage lost. It's over. They had some of the nicest land geographically on the entire planet. Did they really think that everybody was just gonna let them have it? No. It's nice. I'd want it too. And you have to be prepared to defend yourself, which they didn't. The end.
Chapter 10. A Millennium of Conflict, over 1,500 years after the fall of Carthage. The year was 1380. It had been nearly 30 years after the end of the Black Plague that swept across Europe and wiped out roughly half of England's population. The serfs had found themselves under strain from their seemingly incapable government, which itself was under strain from the ongoing 100 Years' War against France. We won't go over the entirety of the noble oppression that led to the Peasants' Revolt of 1381, but know that the overall mismanagement of the realm had led to a peasant rebellion being formed under the leadership of one Wat Tyler. One of the peasants who joined Wat Tyler's rebellion was a woman known as Patricia of Bolingbroke, who joined the rebellion after her husband was executed for poaching boars. Her children were taken from her and made into castle servants for this. And so naturally, she grabbed her pitchfork and sought out Wat Tyler's rebellion. Some say that it was her quick wits that allowed Patricia to quickly rise through the rebellion's impromptu ranks. If you ask me, I think her love affair with Wat Tyler certainly helped. And while most of the rebellion's leaders wrote off Patricia as nothing more than Wat's paramour, Patricia nonetheless gained the influence necessary to lead off her own offshoots of the rebellion. By 1381, Patricia was among the peasants who murdered the Archbishop of Canterbury, making her a prime target to be brought to justice. Soon, Patricia learned that, perhaps as a result of the death of the Archbishop, all but one of her children were tortured or killed. She immediately made her way to the castle that held her final child hostage, only to be ambushed and thrown into the nearest dungeon. As she sat in the jail awaiting her torture and execution, she was approached in the night by a man who called himself Robin. Unbeknownst to her, Robin was a 7th-generation Brujah who you and I might recognize as Robin Hood. The Robin Hood. Patricia and Robin Hood spent the entire night having a back and forth about the injustice of the realm. Robin was impressed, and Patricia was embraced the following night. The first victim of her undead bloodlust was none other than the Baron who destroyed her family. Unfortunately, Patricia's entrance into unlife didn't do much to support the efforts of Wat Tyler's rebellion, for she regularly succumbed to her clan's bane of frenzying. When Wat Tyler's head was finally severed from his neck and his rebellion put to an end, Patricia fled to England, but not before taking on a new name: Tyler. For 2 decades did Tyler travel across Europe. Upon entering Spain and witnessing the terror of the Inquisition, Tyler rose as a voice among kindred that promoted younger vampires to stand up to their sires and wipe them out. In 1394, Tyler, a couple of Brujah, and a mob of peasants stormed a castle in western Spain. This castle housed a particular Ventrue named Hardestat the Elder, who was partly responsible for orchestrating a then 200 or so year old conspiracy of elder vampires known as the Camarilla. You see, it was only natural that the elder vampires had conglomerated themselves into an entity that stood against the anarchist strife caused by their progeny that defined the era. While the Camarilla had yet to become a formal institution, this conspiracy that predated it was in essence the same. During the siege, Tyler struck down Hardestat and diablerized him. The consequences of the diablery of Hardestat were twofold. On one end, Tyler's confidence was only exacerbated by the Amaranth, and while she reasoned that she needed the power of Hardestat to keep herself from being assassinated by other members of the Camarilla conspiracy, diablery is an immortal cost. Tyler had experienced a taste of the forbidden fruit. Let us hope she can maintain it. The other, far more catastrophic result of the diablery is the subsequent series of events that were kicked off, which would reshape vampiric history forever. Meanwhile, at about the same time, our old friend Critias had found himself in Spain after years of traveling and contemplation. By the 15th century, 1415 specifically, Critias was strangely compelled to secretly finance a voyage led by a sea captain who sought to cross the ocean blue to the fabled New World some 80 years before the departure of Columbus. Though Critias never heard from the sea captain ever again, this was none other than Menelaus, who was using his blood-bonded progeny as an ignorant puppet for his own goals. Critias himself wouldn't make his way to the New World until shortly after the Revolutionary War ended in 1783. Even then, he only went unknowingly and at the express will of his sire. Not even Critias knows which of his actions throughout history were truly of his own volition. Meanwhile, the diablery of Hardestat only strengthened the Camarilla resolve, and the founders-to-be banded together their most trusted progeny and servants into a single entity capable of standing against the Anarchs. By 1435, the Camarilla as an institution had been properly formed. The founders of the Camarilla began to openly invite all vampires into the coalition, promising protection from the Mortal Inquisition and the revolting Anarchs. One of these founders, to the shock of Tyler, was none other than Hardestat, the same Hardestat that she certainly diablerized. As it turns out, the founders-to-be performed an entire cover-up of the diablery of Hardestat, the Elder, in order to maintain a visage of order and control, while also undermining the efforts of those Anarchs like Tyler. By the time Tyler uncovered this, the damage to her influence had been done. Conflict between the Camarilla and the Anarchs would persist for nearly 60 years, until the year 1493. There, during those cold October nights, a series of legendary convocations of vampires was held during an event remembered as the Convention of Thorns. I hate to say it, but we're not even going to begin discussing the events that made up each night of the convention, though know that it ultimately resulted in the birth of the modern Camarilla and Sabbat, as well as marking the end of the First Anarch Revolt. During one of the more intense nights of the Forum, as Elder Vampire debated against Elder Vampire, Tyler steps forth from the assembly with a number of Anarchs in her tow, and leaps for the Ventrue posing as Hardestat. She throws back her hood and draws forth two experimental weapons that she was eager to test on her target. Two motherfucking 15th century handguns. She draws forth these two big irons on her hip and proclaims, "May your arrogant black heart be sundered, and your soul sucked down to hell, Hardestat. And also this time stay dead." Tyler then cracked two shots directly into Hardestat's heart at damn near point-blank range. Keep in mind that Hardestat was momentarily distracted, dismantling one of Sasha Vikos' arguments. Silence falls over the entirety of the hall as Hardestat drops to the floor. For a moment, Tyler thinks she secured the kill, though, of course, this was not the case. If anything, Hardestat was pretty much entirely unfazed by the bullets. But before anybody could stop Tyler, she slipped past her line of Anarchs and fled back into the night. Perhaps it was then that vampires realized just how damn near
useless
bullets are against the undead. Funny enough, Tyler was not the only Brujah present at the Convention of Thorns, not counting her Anarchs, though she was certainly the only one on the side of the Anarchs. One of the founders of the Camarilla present during the conventions was that of Adana de Sforza, a Brujah of the 5th generation. Not much can be said of Adana, though she did move to the New World in the 1700s to support the American side of the Revolutionary War. Despite being one of the founders of the Camarilla, many remember Adana de Sforza as a vehement Promethean. If you recall, Prometheans were vampires who ultimately wished to recreate the dream of Carthage. Adana's sire was a vampire named Losario, whose name may just be an Easter egg referencing a character from a poem written by the father of the man who wrote The Vampire. Anyway, after the Camarilla was developed, Adana served as a member of the Camarilla's inner circle for a time, before taking on the role of Justicar. Eventually, her position as Brujah of the Inner Council was surpassed by another Brujah named Gwendolyn. Gwendolyn's record is one shrouded in mystery, though she was allegedly embraced at some point during the Long Night of the 6th century. As the story goes, Gwendolyn was to be burned at the stake for doing silly things like claiming women should have the same rights as men and be allowed to read and stuff. So on the night prior to her witch burning, none other than Troil herself rescues her. Last we heard of Troil, she was entwined with Moloch underneath Tunisia. So, between you and me, I'm almost certain this story, and perhaps even Gwendolyn herself, might not even exist. I'm almost certain this is propaganda pushed by the inner circle, but who am I to say? It's unclear if Gwendolyn is still a member of the current circle that exists tonight. Another Brujah present within the Convention of Thorns was actually a child of Adana de Sforza, named Eleanor de Valois. Eleanor served as a calm moderator, mediator, and facilitator of the many debates that occurred during the convention, which countered the brash devil's advocate that was her sire, Adana. Eleanor's reputation as a voice of reason, despite being allied to the Camarilla, earned her the trust of the Anarchs present at the convention as well. Tyler herself would ultimately flee the entirety of Europe by sailing with the Spanish to the New World in order to escape the Camarilla's hunters. There she came across the Spanish settlement of Cartagena, where she would be found by none other than Helena of Troy. Last we heard of Helena, she and Menelaus survived the total annihilation of Pompeii. In time, both Menelaus and Helena would eventually find themselves in the New World, though for vastly different reasons. As the story goes, Menelaus and Helena would clash for over 1,200 years after Pompeii, yet neither could strike the other down. As Helena's ghoul Prius grew in power, Menelaus staged his own final death and used his blood-bonded progeny Critias to sail to the fabled New World to the west in order to amass his own power. Upon reaching the New World at around the mid-1400s, Menelaus made contact with the Incan tribes and began to mold them into a people capable of standing against Helena. However, as the years passed, Menelaus' eternal grudge against Helena had slowly dissolved. His grudge was a useless burden upon his soul. Upon rejecting his desires for vengeance, clarity presented itself to Menelaus in the form of a plan: a new Carthage. However, by the 16th century, tales of newcomers bringing destruction to the lands of the Mayans had reached the ears of Menelaus. Much to his terror, the Spanish had begun to sail to the New World, with none other than Helena herself leading the charge. As it turns out, Helena used her superior auspex to catch the scent of Menelaus, which trailed across the sea. Curious to see where Menelaus went, Helena and her ilk funded those ventures led by those like Hernando Cortez in order to seek the New World. By the time she reached the Americas, Menelaus' trail had been lost to her. It was about this time that Helena discovered Tyler aboard one of the many ships sailing from Spain to the New World. Helena could see the dark aura that emanated from Tyler, the shroud only possessed by a diablerist, or diabolist. Diabolist? I forget. Rather than dispatch the dangerous and infamous Anarch, however, Helena instead reasoned that Tyler would make for a fine assassin instead, and that she brought Tyler into her fold using the discipline Dominate. Some 30 years later, Helena would establish a blood bond to Tyler, and that would be the last that we hear of our dear Anarch for the time being. Suspicious that Menela hid among the members of the Aztecs, Helena and the Spanish brought about their total destruction. This was the same for other members of the Mayans as well. When Helena came across the Incas and of Menelaus' second attempt at Carthage, Helena, her conquistadores, and her progeny leveled the place entirely, with Menelaus only narrowly escaping. Menela continued to push towards North America, where he continued to amass tribal peoples into forces capable of stopping Helena, yet she never came. Despite losing yet another dream of Carthage, Menelaus wasn't deterred. He continued to pursue further enlightenment and inner peace. Indeed, Menela was on the path of Golconda, and of oneness with the vampiric state. Menela's travels across North America eventually led him to the shores of a great body of water, a lake that would in time be called Lake Michigan. Menela sat upon the shores of what would eventually become Chicago, and he wouldn't be faced with his immortal rival again until the 19th century. From Menelaus to Critias, Robin to Tyler, and countless other legendary Brujah that I haven't even mentioned, all partook in an era of change defined by a millennium of conflict. As more and more Brujah made their way to the New World, a new era of change would follow. So what happens next? Does Menela reach Golconda? Will Tyler escape her blood bond to Helena? Will Critias face his sire's never-ending manipulation? One of my favorite questions, what happens to Dominic after the Cathedral of Flesh? Who else does Robin Hood embrace? Well, technically his name is Robin Leland, but whatever. For the more lore-savvy among you, you might be asking about the famous Brujah that we have yet to speak about, like Smiling Jack or Marguerite Fauchart, Jeremy McNeil or Theo Bell. Well, the truth is, pretty much 99% of the lore surrounding these Brujah protagonists we've come to love are, honest to Kane, just background lore that sets the stage for Chicago by Night. Like, yeah, for real, pretty much all of this is Chicago by Night set dressing. So, until I make that Chicago by Night video, I'm done talking about the Brujah. I got all the Iceberg entries I wanted out of them, and, well, I'm gonna have a ton more to talk about when I talk about Chicago by Night. That's all I got. Take some souls. I'll see you in the next one.